Inside a packed television studio in Washington, D.C., billionaire Senate candidate Blake Masters goes head-to-head with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in a fiery debate about who truly represents America's working class. Blake tries to humiliate her by mocking her past as a teenage janitor, calling her unfit to lead a nation. But just minutes later, Jasmine unleashes a storm of undeniable truth, evidence from her own life that ignites the room and leaves Blake speechless. If a single woman can shatter a billionaire's narrative in 30 seconds, what other lies have the powerful been feeding us all along? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The stage was bathed in cold, clinical light, polished to perfection, like the reputations of the men who typically sat there unchallenged. The banner behind them read, "Future of American Leadership," in bold conservative blue. But there was nothing bold about the silence that hung just before the cameras rolled. The program aired live on Liberty Watch, a channel infamous for platforming monologues disguised as debates. At center stage sat Blake Masters, the tech tycoon turned Senate candidate from Arizona. Tailored to the inch, his posture sharp as the jawlines of the stock photos behind him. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, poised, composed, but under no illusions. She was the lone voice of the working class in a room that treated empathy like weakness. The topic of the night was supposed to be, who deserves to represent working class America? But within minutes, the script had already turned. Blake leaned forward, adjusted his gold cufflink like a man preparing to strike, and with the smirk of someone born into comfort, dropped his bomb. "You used to clean school bathrooms, right? Interesting career path for someone deciding national policy." The words dropped like a hammer, not just on Jasmine, but on the entire premise of the debate. The crowd stirred. The insult wasn't veiled. It was weaponized. Blake sat back with a faint grin, as if he'd exposed something disqualifying, something shameful. But he hadn't exposed Jasmine. He'd exposed something else entirely. The line didn't just sting because of its smug delivery. It stung because it echoed every room that ever told someone, born outside privilege, they didn't belong at the table. In that moment, it was clear. This wasn't a policy debate. It was a class war. And Jasmine Crockett was already standing on the front line, whether anyone admitted it or not. Blake adjusted his sleeve, clearly satisfied with the tension he'd sewn into the room. Then, as if addressing a jury, he twisted the moment even further. "Let me be very clear," he said, gesturing subtly with one hand. "I don't mean any disrespect, but we're talking about leadership here, about vision, intellect, policy. You can't tell me someone who used to mop high school hallways should now be drafting legislation that affects the free market, energy security, or constitutional law." He looked back at Jasmine, then straight into the camera. "That's not elitism. That's common sense." The line echoed with the kind of rehearsed polish reserved for campaign trails and fundraising dinners. But here on live television, it didn't feel like strategy. It felt like revelation, like the unfiltered core of what some still believed. That labor without status is labor without worth. A soft gasp came from somewhere in the third row. Someone else, a young man in a collared shirt and Liberty Watch lanyard, nodded slowly as if Blake had finally said what others hadn't dared to articulate out loud. And that was the danger. Blake hadn't just insulted Jasmine. He had spoken a coded language fluent to anyone who had ever measured worth in titles, schools, or last names. Jasmine had been here before. Not on television, not at this scale, but in essence. The tone, the implication, the hierarchy. It was the same as when she was 14, pushing that janitor's cart through the east wing of her junior high school, trying not to make noise while the students she studied beside walked past her like she was part of the furniture. She remembered the sting of bleach in her nostrils, the way her palms dried out from too much ammonia. She remembered scrubbing the same bathroom twice because a group of boys had smeared wet paper towels across the walls just to see if she'd come back to clean it up. And she had. Quietly, with her head down and her dignity bruised but not broken. She had never been ashamed of that job. But she knew Blake wasn't just talking about the job. He was talking about her place, where he believed she belonged. And that wasn't just political commentary. That was an old script, recycled in real time. The belief that people born into work are not born for leadership. Blake leaned back, scanning the audience, his tone light but laced with condescension. "Look, I'm not saying hard work isn't admirable," he said, shrugging slightly. "But Congress isn't a job training program. It's the brain of the country. We need minds that were shaped by policy, not pine-scented industrial soap." A few low chuckles trickled from the audience, awkward, uncertain. Even among Blake's supporters, something in the air was becoming dense, heavy, as if they'd all witnessed a line being crossed, but weren't quite sure how to react. Jasmine's gaze didn't leave him. She didn't blink. She didn't look away, because she understood what he had just done. And more importantly, she understood who else had heard it. There were millions of viewers watching at home, some in trailers, some on lunch breaks, some in second jobs they'd never expected to still hold in their 40s, and some of them had pushed the same carts, worn the same aprons, cleaned the same toilets. And now they were hearing a man in a $1,000 suit tell them, on national television, that they weren't smart enough to matter. The camera panned slowly toward Jasmine, capturing every detail. The stillness in her face, the fire behind her eyes, the faint rise of her chest as she drew breath. Not to react in anger, but to contain the storm without letting it consume her. Blake wasn't finished. "We can't let sentimentality become the standard," he continued, his voice now colder, sharper. "If we do, we risk putting America's future in the hands of nostalgia instead of competence. I'm sure Representative Crockett worked hard, but the question is, was that hard work intellectual? Was it strategic? Or was it just survival?" That final word, survival, hung in the air like a live wire. And there it was again. The quiet belief that those who survived didn't earn a seat at the table. They just happened to stumble into the room. Jasmine said nothing, not yet, but the studio felt different now. No longer simply a space for debate, but a battleground for memory, pride, and invisible wounds reopened by rhetoric masquerading as logic. The host cleared his throat, fidgeting with his papers, unsure whether to steer the conversation forward or let the moment sit in its full discomfort. And Jasmine, still silent, kept her fingers folded gently across her lap, because she knew that what had just been said didn't only belong to her past. It belonged to millions who had been dismissed in the exact same way. And she also knew the next thing she said would not be for Blake Masters. It would be for every janitor, waitress, mechanic, and night shift worker who had ever been told their story didn't count. And the studio, so sure of itself just moments ago, was about to feel the weight of that truth. The silence stretched so long, it felt like time had been suspended. Blake Masters sat smugly in his seat, confident in the blow he'd just delivered. His words had been rehearsed, delivered like a headline, designed to wound without leaving blood. But Jasmine Crockett didn't meet him with outrage. No fire, no raised voice, just something slower, something more devastating. She reached forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the microphone like it was a relic from another world. Then she leaned in, and the entire studio seemed to lean with her. Her voice was low, not weak, but steady, composed, with a stillness that unsettled more than any outburst ever could. "I cleaned school floors to buy groceries for my little brother," she said. The sentence didn't crackle with fury. It rang with fact. There was no victimhood in her tone. There was ownership, a kind of moral gravity that couldn't be fabricated, couldn't be performed. She wasn't telling a sob story. She was offering a history lesson. The studio lights reflected off the gloss of the desk, catching the tension in the muscles of her jaw. Her posture remained untouched, but every word reshaped the atmosphere in the room. "You may call it low," she continued, her eyes now locked not on Blake, but on the audience. The real one. The millions watching from living rooms, hospital night shifts, break rooms filled with vending machines and flickering fluorescent bulbs. But I call it necessary. The air in the room compressed, the kind of tightness that made even breathing feel political. She didn't blink. She didn't pause for applause. Because this wasn't theater. This was testimony. Then she spoke again, slower, the syllables grounded like boots on concrete. I woke up every morning at 4:10, not because I wanted to, because I had to. Her eyes unfocused slightly, not out of distraction, but memory. You could feel her walking back into that version of herself, the girl with aching feet before sunrise and a head full of math problems and mop water. My mother left the house at 3:30. She worked the early shift at the nursing home. I'd get up when she left. No alarm clock, just instinct. I'd boil water to wash my face because the heater didn't work. Then I'd walk 2 blocks to Travis Elementary, go around to the back entrance and unlock the janitor's closet with a key Mr. Green gave me. The audience was frozen, not by shock, but by something heavier, accountability. She exhaled, not dramatically, but like someone who'd been holding a story for years and was now finally willing to set it down. The gloves were too big for my hands. They used to slip off if I scrubbed too hard. The mop head was older than me. Sometimes I'd hum to keep my mind off the smell. Bleach, mildew, disinfectant. I hated the mirrors most. Not because they were hard to clean, but because they showed me. Tired, 14, alone. The words landed like slow-moving wreckage. She wasn't asking for pity. She was excavating a truth the room had tried to bury. She straightened slightly, letting the silence breathe before she shattered it again. By 7:10, I'd change out of the overalls, spray perfume under my shirt to cover the smell of ammonia, and sit in the second row of Algebra 1. Sometimes the bleach would sting my eyes. Sometimes I'd fall asleep on my worksheet. No one ever asked why. No one ever noticed my hands were red and raw. Her voice didn't waver, but something deeper did. A vibration underneath the words. Something that sounded like grace under pressure, too familiar to collapse. And then came the sentence that no script could write. "They didn't laugh when I was scrubbing floors," she said. "They just didn't look at me at all." The line hung there, raw and unadorned, not asking for empathy but demanding acknowledgement. It was more than a rebuttal. It was an indictment of every system, every institution, every gaze that had ever looked through her like she wasn't worth seeing. Even Blake Masters, so smug just moments before, shifted in his chair. Not because he felt guilt, but because the crowd's attention had shifted. Jasmine had taken it back, not with force, but with truth that could not be unspoken. She looked up then, not at Blake, not at the cameras, but past them, into every home, every face, every person who had ever been told that dignity was reserved for the clean-handed. Her silence before had been strategic, but this was revolutionary, not loud, not angry, just undeniable. And still, after all that truth, all that quiet power, someone laughed. Not loud, not defiant, just a few dry chuckles from the far right section of the studio audience. The kind of laughter that tries to hide behind politeness, but stinks of cruelty. It wasn't that Jasmine had said something funny. It was that her dignity had made them uncomfortable. And instead of confronting that discomfort, they chose mockery. A few others joined in, hesitant at first, then emboldened by the awkward safety of numbers. Like jackals circling, they laughed not because she was weak, but because she had survived something they didn't understand. One woman, mid-50s, pearl earrings, pressed blazer, sat motionless near the center aisle. Her spine straightened slightly, as if something in her had shifted. Her eyes, once glazed over with passive interest, sharpened and locked on Jasmine with an intensity that hadn't been there a moment ago. She didn't clap. She didn't shake her head. But the way she sat, the sudden stillness in her shoulders, spoke louder than words. She had seen something real. Richard Moore, the host, adjusted his tie with the discomfort of a man realizing the room was slipping out of his control. His voice came through tight, filtered, rehearsed. "Let's keep this respectful, please," he said, trying to pour water on a flame that had already ignited the air. But Blake Masters wasn't done. He leaned forward again, elbows on the glass table, and smirked with the arrogance of someone who'd never had to apologize for being cruel. He nodded slightly, as if indulging the host's request, then looked back at Jasmine with the same casual detachment he might offer a waiter delivering the wrong drink. "Respectfully," he said, his tone anything but, Being poor doesn't make someone wise. Mopping floors doesn't equal leadership. And hardship? That's not a qualification. It's a circumstance. The laughter didn't return this time, because now everyone knew. They weren't watching a debate. They were watching a dismantling. And Jasmine Crockett, she hadn't even stood up yet. And as the air still trembled with the fallout of Blake's last attack, he seized the silence like a man mistaking shock for submission. He leaned forward with theatrical poise, carefully arranging each word like a blade poised for the jugular. Leadership, he said, his voice smooth and rehearsed, should inspire excellence, not just pity. There was no hint of hesitation, no flicker of awareness in his tone. It was a cold statement of belief, born not of malice but of certainty. The kind of certainty that only comes from never having been ignored, or invisible, or exhausted by survival. America doesn't need janitor sob stories, he added, his voice tightening, rising with performative confidence. It needs results. That was it, the signal. The room cracked open as the conservative block of the audience erupted into applause. Not spontaneous, not joyful, but mechanical. Applause as confirmation, not celebration. As if they'd been waiting all night for someone to say it out loud, for someone to validate the quiet disdain they carried for the stories they didn't understand. Hands slapped together in rhythm, eyes darted across the room like searchlights looking for agreement, and a few people even stood. Not because Blake had elevated the conversation, but because he had reduced it to something they could comfortably control, a hierarchy. One where they still sat safely at the top. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't blink. The noise washed over her like rain against stone. The applause, however orchestrated, failed to touch her. Because what Blake had failed to see, what the entire room had failed to anticipate, was that silence was not her retreat. It was her staging ground. A pause not of defeat, but of precision. She reached, slowly, deliberately, into the inside lining of her blazer. No performance, no dramatics, just a motion filled with the kind of calm you only learn from years of carrying your story in places where it was never welcome. Her fingers emerged holding a small object, aged and laminated, the edges scuffed and curled from time. She placed it gently on the glass table between them, turning it until the camera could find it. And then she lifted it, raised it with both hands, holding it just below eye level, like a document submitted into evidence. It was a photo ID, grainy, black and white. The face of a young girl stared back through the plastic window, wide-eyed, expressionless, her hair pulled back tightly, her lips pressed together as if holding something back even then. Under the photo, printed in faded block letters, it read, J. Crockett, custodial assistant, age 14. There was no applause now, no laughter, no whisper. The room froze, as if time itself had recoiled in embarrassment. Because what Jasmine Crockett had just done wasn't an act of retaliation, it was an act of resurrection. She didn't explain the photo, she didn't narrate what it meant, she just held it, steadily, proudly, unapologetically, in front of the very people who had just cheered the idea that it disqualified her. It was not just a badge, it was a statement of existence, proof of labor, evidence of dignity earned in silence, and it was undeniable. Even Blake Masters, so confident just seconds earlier, shifted slightly in his chair. The applause that once buoyed him had vanished, leaving behind only the echo of something unspoken, something unsettling. He had not silenced her. He had summoned her, and she had answered with a photograph. And just as the room sat suspended in the weight of that image, J. Crockett, custodial assistant, age 14, something unexpected pierced the silence. A faint electronic chime echoed through the studio, followed by a low murmur from the production booth. The host, Richard Moore, pressed his fingers to his earpiece, eyes narrowing as he listened. Then, with a tone devoid of his usual polish, he looked into the camera and said, "We've just received a live call from someone who says he has a statement relevant to tonight's discussion." He hesitated, not because the moment wasn't welcome, but because it was suddenly bigger than the format he was supposed to control. "Go ahead, sir. You're live." The line crackled briefly. Then came the voice, deep, weathered, deliberate. Not trembling, not loud, but carrying the quiet authority of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to remember. "My name is Mr. Harold Green," the caller said. His pace was unhurried, like a man walking across decades with each word. "I was head custodian at Travis Elementary in South Dallas. I hired that girl." You could feel the oxygen drain from the room. The audience shifted, not in restlessness, but in reverence. Blake Masters leaned slightly forward, face unreadable, and for the first time that night, he wasn't preparing a retort. He was listening, because the man on the phone wasn't a partisan. He wasn't a planted call or a political stunt. He was truth on the line, and the gravity of his voice told everyone so. Mr. Green continued, his words landing like bricks. "I worked there for 27 years, cleaned every hallway, fixed every leak, scraped gum off desks, and watched generations of kids come and go. But I only remember one student who ever knocked on the maintenance office door and asked if there was any work she could do." He paused, just long enough for the tension to grow unbearable. It was Jasmine. She was 14, said her mom was working nights, and the food stamps weren't cutting it. Said her little brother had been crying over a growling stomach, and she was tired of seeing her mama come home with her shoes falling apart. The words weren't poetic. They were surgical, and they cut deeper than any monologue could. Richard Moore sat frozen. Even the studio crew, previously unseen, had stopped behind the cameras. No one dared interrupt, because this wasn't a memory being shared. It was a record being corrected, live. Mr. Green's voice grew steadier, stronger. "I told her I couldn't pay her much. Just a few dollars under the table and some leftover lunch from the faculty fridge. You know what she said? 'That's enough, sir.' She came in every morning before class, scrubbed toilets, wiped windows, swept stairwells, and then she'd go sit in science class like she hadn't just inhaled ammonia for an hour." There was no pity in his tone, just clarity, just fact, and within it, an indictment of everything Blake had dismissed, everything the audience had clapped for. "And let me tell you something," he added, his voice tightening now, brimming with conviction. "That girl never once asked for sympathy, never once asked to leave early, never once acted like the work was beneath her. But I've watched CEOs throw tantrums over broken coffee machines. I've watched men in $1,000 suits ignore me when I mopped under their shoes. Jasmine, she handed me paper towels without me asking." A few people in the audience exhaled, quiet, guilty breaths. Others stared at the floor. Some watched Jasmine, who remained still, eyes focused, hands resting lightly on the glass table, as if holding back a dam that didn't need to break. Then came the line, the one no one would forget. "She didn't mop floors," Mr. Green said slowly. "She held that school together." The words landed with the force of a verdict. It wasn't flattery. It was testimony. It wasn't a defense. It was a declaration. And in that moment, the hierarchy Blake Masters had so carefully constructed collapsed like a house built on wet paper. The Ivy League degrees, the polished rhetoric, the smirking dismissal, all of it crumbled beneath the weight of a janitor's voice carrying the truth of a teenage girl who chose work over rest, responsibility over resentment. No music swelled, no applause followed, just a heavy, sacred quiet. Because for the first time that night, no one was performing. They were remembering, and the voice of a custodian had just done what no political talking point ever could. He made Jasmine Crockett real, not just a congresswoman, not just a guest, but a living ledger of quiet survival. And an answer to the very question that had opened the debate: who deserves to lead America's working class? That call had just given the answer, and it was not Blake Masters. And as the final syllables of Mr. Green's voice dissolved into the charged silence, she held that school together. It was as if the walls themselves absorbed the truth. The studio lights, once bright and clinical, now seemed harsher, exposing not just the faces in the crowd, but the weight of everything unspoken. The applause that once followed Blake's slick one-liners had died. The pride that once sat comfortably in the room's polished rows now felt exposed, fragile. Jasmine Crockett hadn't lifted her voice. She hadn't raised a fist. But something seismic had happened anyway. And as the stillness grew heavy, almost sacred, one man stood. He rose slowly, like a man waking from a long, unearned comfort. He looked to be in his early 60s, wearing a pressed navy blazer and a name tag clipped neatly to the lapel. Tom Garrison, Columbus, Ohio. A businessman. The kind of man who, just an hour earlier, might have nodded along with Blake's remarks about results and standards. But now he stood without applause, without words, without any gesture except the most human one: presence. His eyes were fixed on Jasmine, not in admiration, not in pity, but in something rarer: recognition. As if, for the first time in his life, he saw the quiet architecture of struggle not as a liability, but as credibility. He didn't smile, he didn't speak, but in that moment he said everything. "I didn't understand before. Now I stand with her." Not in slogan, not in speech, but in silence that was deafening. Others followed, not all at once, not with fanfare, but like memory catching fire. A woman near the back adjusted her scarf and rose to her feet, her eyes never leaving the stage. A young intern seated near the soundboard stood next, lips pressed tight, hands trembling slightly. Then two men from opposite ends of the crowd, one in a blue-collar jacket, the other in a tailored vest, both rose together, casting brief glances at one another like strangers discovering they had both been hiding the same truth. It wasn't a protest, it wasn't a performance, it was a reckoning. A slow, spreading realization that the seat of honor hadn't belonged to the loudest man in the room, but to the woman who had once walked to school in the dark, scrubbed toilets before algebra, and sat quietly through cruelty until it broke itself. The very act of standing became contagious, not out of obedience, but out of shared awareness, as if everyone had suddenly been reminded that to stay seated now was to stay small. No one instructed the cameras to pan, but they did. They swept across the growing wall of silence rising from the crowd, shoulders straight, hands at their sides, some blinking back tears they didn't quite understand. They were no longer an audience. They were witnesses. And Jasmine Crockett had not asked for their approval. She had simply endured long enough for the truth to stand on its own. And now, finally, so did they. And as the standing crowd settled into a reverent hush, not out of fatigue, but out of reverence, Jasmine Crockett moved with the quiet certainty of someone who knew the next moment would not need volume to leave a mark. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't meet Blake's eyes. She simply reached down with her left hand and slowly opened a slim leather folder resting beside her notes. The motion was small, unceremonious, but in a room charged with tension, even that movement felt seismic. From inside, she pulled out a single sheet of aged paper, creased at the folds, the corners slightly curled. It wasn't pristine. It didn't need to be. The discoloration around the edges only made it more real. The paper had the faint yellow tint of a document kept not for display, but for survival. She unfolded it with the care one might use when handling something more human than paper. And as the studio lights hit the page, a faint glint of worn ink shimmered faintly. No official seal, no embossed letterhead, just words, handwritten, deliberate, unshakably sincere. Jasmine looked at the letter for a second before placing it on the desk in front of her, face up toward the camera. She rested her fingertips lightly on its top edge, not to claim it, but to stabilize it, as if the weight of its meaning might otherwise carry it away. Then she spoke, not to the audience, not to Blake Masters, not even to the host, but as if to the silence itself. "This," she said, her voice quiet but unmistakably steady, "is the only recommendation letter I had when I applied for college." A beat passed, long enough for the words to sting. The audience didn't shift. They absorbed. Her gaze remained forward, unwavering. No trophies, no summer programs, no senator's family friend to make a call on my behalf. Just this. She paused, then gently rotated the letter so the cameras could see the handwritten lines at its center. No typing, no signature block, just honest script in faded blue ink. The letter read, "To whom it may concern, Jasmine Crockett has worked after hours as a custodial assistant at our elementary school for over a year. Despite her age, she has demonstrated discipline, maturity, and a rare sense of quiet leadership. This young girl cleaned our floors, then went on to debate ethics with my faculty. She has no father at home, and her mother works 2 jobs, yet Jasmine arrives before sunrise, completes her duties, and still manages to outperform students twice her advantage. She does not ask for praise, but she deserves a chance. Please consider her for admission, not because she's had it easy, but because she's done the hard things with grace. Signed in graceful looping cursive, Eleanor M. Keene, Principal, Travis Elementary. You could hear someone inhale sharply from the 3rd row. Another person, someone who had stood just minutes earlier, closed their eyes. Not out of sorrow, but out of recognition. Because that letter wasn't just a reference, it was a monument, a declaration written in ink and humility that quietly shattered the glass walls people like Blake Masters insisted were natural. Jasmine didn't rush. She let the room see it, read it, feel it. Then she placed her hand gently over the letter, not to hide it, but to ground it, like one might place a hand on a gravestone or a Bible before a vow. They say leadership should come from legacy, she added softly, but all I had was this, and the will to never let it be the end of my story. And for the 2nd time that night, the room went still, not because they were stunned, but because they had finally truly understood. And as the final words from Jasmine echoed through that room, they say leadership should come from legacy, but all I had was this. The studio didn't erupt. It didn't collapse. It transformed. The silence that followed wasn't absence. It was respect. It was a reckoning. The kind of silence that crawls beneath the skin and makes people think about the stories they've dismissed, the hands they've overlooked, the truths they've called too personal to matter in policy. Jasmine hadn't demanded sympathy. She had made dignity visible, and in doing so, she shattered the carefully constructed myth that power only belongs to those born near it. What happened next didn't require production cues or flashy graphics. It didn't even need commentary. All it took was a single clip, 27 seconds long, captured by a shaky cell phone camera from row 4. The video began with her hands, one holding a janitor ID badge, worn and curled at the edges, the other holding a single sheet of lined paper, folded so tightly it trembled as she placed it beside the badge. The caption read simply, Jasmine Crockett, Congresswoman, former custodian, survivor. But it wasn't the image that went viral. It was her voice, quiet, resolute, devastating. I was never beneath dignity. I was beneath privilege. 7 words delivered without anger, without performance. Just truth so sharp it cut through algorithmic noise like a blade through silk. The clip spread like a controlled fire, starting on TikTok, leaping to X, then Facebook, then Instagram, then the inboxes of people who never watched debates, who hated politics, who thought they'd seen it all. Within 12 hours, the clip had surpassed 6 million views, not with flashy headlines, not with partisan outrage, but with raw momentum. People reposting, not because they supported a party, but because something in that moment felt like a mirror. A quiet revolution was unfolding in pixels and shares. Viewers didn't just watch the clip. They paused it, replayed it, studied the flicker in Jasmine's eyes as she said those words, not to accuse, but to reveal. They dissected the line like scripture. I was never beneath dignity, a declaration of self-worth in a country that still teaches millions to apologize for being born poor. I was beneath privilege, a damning diagnosis of the systems that confuse suffering with failure. The comments flooded in like a second audience, and this time it was global. This wasn't a speech. This was a reckoning. I've worked 3 jobs and never once heard someone say that on TV. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She stood, and I felt seen. Teachers reposted it during staff meetings. Janitors played it during break. High school students stitched it into montages about rising from disadvantage. And then quietly but unmistakably, the phrase started appearing on signs, at food banks, in union halls, and even printed on the side of a coffee shop tip jar in Milwaukee. Not beneath dignity, beneath privilege. The studio's marketing team hadn't even uploaded the official debate yet when their switchboards crashed. News outlets scrambled. Commentators, unsure how to frame the moment without sounding out of touch, defaulted to neutrality. But the public didn't wait for permission. They made it their own. Conservative hosts tried to pivot, calling the clip emotional theater. But the backlash was swift. Not because people were choosing a side, but because they had already chosen truth. The original uploader, a college intern named Lacey Ramirez, posted a follow-up an hour later. Her face was tear-streaked, but her voice was clear. "I filmed that because something in the room changed. I felt it. I didn't even realize my hands were shaking until I hit stop. And I've never shared anything political online. But that wasn't politics. That was justice." Her video gained 1.2 million likes in a day. And while the platforms exploded with commentary, edits, duets, and remixes, one group stayed almost entirely silent: politicians. Because Jasmine hadn't just told a story, she had issued a challenge, one that couldn't be dodged with buzzwords or filibusters. She had exposed something terrifying to those in power, that the people don't need polished talking points. They need someone who remembers what the floor feels like when you're cleaning it, not standing on it. By the time national news picked it up, anchors weren't asking, "What did she mean?" They were asking, "Why did it take this long for someone to say it?" One segment on MSNBC played the clip 3 times in a row before cutting to a roundtable that, uncharacteristically, just sat silent for nearly 15 seconds before speaking. CNN added a graphic: "Dignity versus privilege," the quote that's defining the debate. Meanwhile, across the aisle, even some conservative voices broke formation. A retired GOP mayor from Indiana tweeted, "I've disagreed with her policies, but I'll be damned if that isn't the most honest thing I've heard in years." The impact reached beyond the Beltway. At a high school in Memphis, a teacher printed out the quote and taped it to every locker in her hallway. In a fast food restaurant in rural Pennsylvania, a manager started their morning shift by reading it aloud. In a subway car in Brooklyn, someone graffitied it onto the tiled wall. Not in protest, but as a quiet sermon. And still, Jasmine Crockett never reposted the video. She never commented, never claimed the moment, or tried to monetize it. When asked by a journalist later that week if she expected the reaction, she simply said, "No." But I'm not surprised, because I know how many of us have been waiting to be told we were never less. We were just locked out. No spin, no platform, just clarity. And in a year bloated with political noise, her words cut through everything. Because in the end, people didn't remember the applause for Blake. They didn't remember the talking points or the moderator's questions. They remembered a badge. They remembered a girl. They remembered the truth rising without permission. And they remembered the voice that said, quietly, finally, unshakably, "I was never beneath dignity. I was beneath privilege." And while Jasmine remained silent, never reposting the viral clip, never offering interviews or follow-ups, the world around her began to speak. Loudly, visibly, relentlessly. Her quiet act of defiance had cracked something open. And through that fracture poured a flood the system hadn't prepared for. What started as a single video became a movement of memory. The internet, for once, didn't twist the narrative. It carried it. And it carried it into classrooms, back kitchens, night shifts, and commuter trains where people had spent years hiding the very beginnings that Jasmine had dared to hold up in full view. It began with one post. A middle school teacher in Michigan uploaded a grainy photo of herself at 15, hunched over a mop bucket in the hallway of a movie theater. Her caption read, "I used to clean popcorn off sticky floors before grading essays. I was never beneath dignity. I was beneath privilege. Thank you, Jasmine." The post hit 200,000 likes in 3 hours. Then came another, from a Honduran immigrant working construction in Arizona. He posted a sun-faded ID badge from his first job as a janitor at a gas station. In broken but powerful English, he wrote, "I still clean, but now I clean my son's college dorm when I visit. He says I taught him what leadership looks like." The photo went viral, not for the badge, but for the dirt still visible under his thumbnail. It was too real to scroll past. Then the flood came. Cooks, housekeepers, farm workers, security guards. People who had never spoken publicly about their pasts started posting photos and fragments of their origin stories. A woman who now worked as a nurse in Baltimore shared an image of her bent over a sink in a fast food kitchen, hair tucked under a visor. She wrote, "When I applied for nursing school, I used a manager's note on a napkin as my reference. They said I wasn't polished, but I knew how to survive." Every post wasn't just a tribute to Jasmine. It was a rebellion against the shame the world had stapled to their stories. They were not just posting selfies. They were reclaiming archives. Fragments of lives they had been taught to edit out of their resumes were now being held up like medals. One caption read, "Here's me cleaning motel bathrooms with my mom when I was 11. We didn't know we were teaching each other how to lead." But we were. Soon the hashtags became their own uprising. Beneath privilege, Joshi, where leaders, begin first job files. Knotless, just earlier thousands. Then tens of thousands, then millions of posts poured in. Each one a silent scream against the structures that had taught people to hide where they started. Jasmine's quote had not only resonated, it had detonated something far more personal. A former high school janitor in Alabama, now a social worker, uploaded a picture of her first pay stub, $62.15. She captioned it, "They told me stories like mine don't get told unless they're tragic, but Jasmine made it clear they can also be powerful." The flood crossed borders. In London, a Pakistani refugee posted a photo of the grocery aisle where he'd worked overnight shifts while taking online classes. In Cape Town, a young mother posted an image of her cutting grass outside a school, barefoot, pushing a broken mower, with the caption, "The world thought we were invisible, but Jasmine's voice made us appear." But it wasn't just the content that stunned observers. It was the tone. There was no self-pity, no bitterness, just revelation. There was rage, yes, but a sacred kind. A rage that didn't seek to burn, but to unbury. A collective decision to no longer be complicit in their own erasure. Some images were black and white, pulled from old family albums. Others were recent, taken on night shifts and smoke breaks, but they all told the same story. We were always here. You just never looked at us until now. The tension spread offline. In Chicago, a group of cafeteria workers taped their high school job photos to the kitchen walls with a sign above that read, "This is where leadership starts." In a university in Oregon, students began curating a hallway installation made entirely of childhood ID cards and first job uniforms. They called it "The Floor We Stand On." Even a small-town library in Vermont dedicated a shelf to memoirs and essays written by working-class authors, calling it the Jasmine Crockett Collection. The sheer scale of response left political operatives scrambling. Campaign consultants didn't know how to spin it. Pollsters couldn't quantify it, because it wasn't about approval ratings. It was about memory made visible. People weren't choosing Jasmine over Blake Masters. They were choosing to no longer apologize for where they began. And Jasmine hadn't asked for their stories. She had just given them permission to be told. In a single viral wave, the debate about qualifications had flipped. The question was no longer, who is polished enough to lead, but who remembers what it took to get here? No one saw it coming, but Jasmine Crockett did, because she'd lived it, and now so had the rest of America. And as the world moved around her, with timelines ablaze, classroom walls freshly decorated, and millions of hearts reawakening to the power of quiet beginnings, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't take a victory lap. She didn't bask in the public's validation. She let the silence do what it always had, tell the truth. And in the face of all this, of the wave she'd never intended to start, Blake Masters finally responded, or rather, his office did. The statement arrived like a shrug disguised as policy. No press conference, no face, just a sterile email to the media titled, "Statement from the Office of Blake Masters." Its contents were as frigid as its formatting. "We believe voters should judge on performance, not sentiment." 12 words, lifeless, weighted with calculated detachment. Not a single mention of Jasmine. Not a single acknowledgement of the moment now echoing through homes, classrooms, and town halls across the country. It was the kind of message that spoke volumes through what it refused to say. It wasn't just indifferent, it was engineered that way. A wall of language designed to insulate, to discredit emotion, to reduce survival into softness and struggle into spin. But what Blake didn't understand, and never would, was that people weren't moved by sentiment. They were moved by recognition. And in trying to dismiss her with bureaucracy, he only made her silence louder. Jasmine didn't issue a counterattack. She didn't sit for interviews or release carefully worded rebuttals. She didn't take the bait. What she did instead was far more devastating. At exactly 6:47 p.m. the following evening, she posted a single image to her verified account. No caption, no tag, just a frame, square and grainy, lit by what looked like the warm bulb of a kitchen lamp. The photo showed her janitor badge, J. Crockett, custodial assistant, age 14, resting gently atop a folded piece of paper. The edges of the paper were yellowed with time, and just beneath the badge, in pen so deliberate it looked like it had been written in silence, was one sentence. Dignity isn't decided by your title, it's revealed by what you do when no one's watching. She didn't even sign it, but the internet didn't need a signature. The image struck like a stone in the still water. Not chaotic, but heavy, rippling outward into thousands of reposts in minutes. And not from bots or strategists or pundits, but from teachers, from nurses, from delivery drivers and custodians, and working parents and middle schoolers who had been watching quietly, holding their breath as the world debated whether someone like them could truly belong in the rooms where decisions are made. The image did not trend. It unfolded. It appeared not in viral spikes, but in sacred waves, pinned to bulletin boards in break rooms, shared in WhatsApp threads between night shift workers, printed and slid into the plastic covers of student binders. It was not a political artifact, it was a map, a compass, a reminder that being unseen didn't mean being unworthy, and it traveled far, beyond the news cycles, beyond party lines, beyond the boundaries of who was supposed to matter. Teachers were the first to respond en masse. In Kansas City, a school librarian printed the quote and taped it above every row of student lockers. In El Paso, a middle school principal began reading it aloud during the Monday morning intercom announcements, calling it their new character moment. And in Detroit, a third-grade teacher asked her students to write about what they do when no one's looking. One student, age 9, wrote, "I feed the dog and don't tell my mom because I know she's tired." The quote was quietly added to email footers by counselors and social workers. It was stitched onto denim by an independent artist who'd once cleaned office floors at night to fund her studio. In a church in Atlanta, a pastor opened his Sunday sermon with the line, paused and simply said, "There are truths that aren't scriptures, but still feel sacred." But nowhere was the quote felt more viscerally than in the very spaces Jasmine had once occupied. The public schools, the cafeterias, the forgotten corners of service that so often go unmentioned in patriotic speeches and campaign ads. In a community center in Tulsa, a night janitor named Miriam printed the photo and taped it to her cleaning cart. When asked why, she said, "Because it's the only time I've seen someone tell my story without turning it into a joke." In a cafeteria in Boston, kitchen staff printed the quote and laminated it, placing it next to the time clock. And in Newark, a student council rep lobbied to have the words printed at the top of every Monday schedule for the rest of the year. The principal agreed. It wasn't just a message, it was a mirror. One held gently, not in judgment, but in affirmation. And what stared back from it was not weakness, not emotion, not even inspiration. It was truth, quiet, undeniable, steady as breath. And Blake Masters, armed with his metrics and performance talking points, found himself ghosted by the very people whose lives he claimed to understand. Because performance, the world was learning, isn't just about sound bites and polished sentences. Performance is rising before the sun. It's staying late to finish a job no one sees. It's cleaning floors with cracked hands and going home with your head high, even when the world calls your labor unskilled. That's performance. That's dignity. And no title could give it or take it away. So when Jasmine posted that image, she wasn't speaking to power. She was speaking around it. To the people who've never had microphones but always had something worth saying. To the kids sitting in back rows who know the smell of bleach better than perfume. To the mothers, the grandfathers, the daughters, the janitors, the aides, the invisible ones who are invisible no more. Dignity isn't decided by your title. It's revealed by what you do when no one's watching. The country didn't need a press tour. It didn't need a campaign strategy. It had a sentence, and the sentence was enough. And while Jasmine's photo continued to echo in hallways, homes, and hearts, something deeper settled beneath the noise. Not applause, not outrage, but understanding. Like the way a battlefield goes quiet not after victory, but after realization. Because her story, simple, unpolished, and unflinching, had done something no campaign had ever could. It forced America to look in the mirror. And for the first time in a long time, what looked back wasn't power in a suit. It was labor. It was memory. It was dignity earned the hard way, in shoes worn down by places most politicians have never set foot in. And through that mirror, a question began to burn. What if we've been measuring worth the wrong way all along? The lesson didn't arrive like a lecture. It arrived like a punch to the ribs. Quiet, invisible workers, those who mop, wipe, lift, bend, clean, file, pour, serve, were finally centered not as symbols, but as leaders in waiting. Jasmine didn't need to shout that message. She was the proof of it. She had once been called invisible. Yet the moment she held up that ID badge, every person who'd ever been overlooked felt seen. Her story showed us that greatness doesn't announce itself with a spotlight, but leaves evidence in the dark. And when that evidence is finally brought into the light, it doesn't just inspire, it indicts. Because the real injustice was never that she had to clean floors at 14. It was that society saw that moment as disqualifying, that the world equated poverty with shame instead of survival, that titles and accents and zip codes became silent gatekeepers, deciding who gets to lead and who must remain silent. Blake Masters' jab didn't expose Jasmine, it exposed us, our bias, our arrogance, our failure to recognize grit when it isn't dressed in polish. And Jasmine's refusal to retaliate, that was the turning point. Because she didn't just win a debate, she reframed the battlefield. The humanity in her story cut deeper than any soundbite ever could. Because it wasn't about her pain, it was about how she carried it, about how she turned cleaning rags into stepping stones and silence into strategy. The girl who once inhaled bleach fumes at dawn now breathes life into a generation told they'll never be enough. And with just one sentence, dignity isn't decided by your title. She built something no billionaire ever could, a moral infrastructure, a framework of truth that doesn't collapse under scrutiny, but grows stronger the closer you look. The lesson then is not just about Jasmine, it's about us, about what kind of country we pretend to be, and what kind we truly are when tested. Are we a land of opportunity or of optics? Do we celebrate resilience, or do we only tolerate it until it makes us uncomfortable? Jasmine's silence in the face of cruelty was not weakness. It was a blueprint, a reminder that sometimes the loudest revolution is carried not in shouts, but in posture, in poise, in choosing to be bigger than the insult because your purpose has always been louder than the room. Her story also taught us something brutal, that the hardest part of rising isn't climbing, it's doing it while the world pretends your ladder doesn't exist. Jasmine built hers out of mop handles, 4 a.m. alarms, and 1,000 ignored moments that she stacked into a foundation no man could shake. And when she stood before the country, she didn't ask to be accepted. She dared them not to look away. And in doing so, she changed what leadership looked like, not by redefining success, but by restoring value to how success begins. In the end, the true moral wasn't about pity. It wasn't about political sides. It was about seeing labor as legacy. Understanding that janitors, servers, delivery drivers, and cashiers are not stepping stones for the ambitious, they are pillars of the nation. And when we mock their work, we don't just dishonor them, we dismantle our own future. Jasmine reminded us that courage isn't just speaking truth to power. Sometimes it's surviving power long enough to outlast it. Sometimes it's walking into a studio where you know the deck is stacked, and choosing not to bow, but to stand still and let the truth do the speaking. What Jasmine left behind wasn't a viral moment. It was a movement built from quiet strength, From the understanding that the measure of leadership is not how well you speak when the world's watching, but what you choose to do when no one sees. That the most noble acts often happen off camera, in silence, in hardship. And in that silence, a new kind of anthem is born, not made of flags and slogans, but of scraped knees, aching backs, and hands that never stopped working, even when the world stopped caring. So if there's one lesson Jasmine Crockett gave us, etched in a badge, whispered in a sentence, and carried across a nation, it's this. Where you start matters, not because it defines you, but because it proves you never had the luxury of quitting. And that kind of resilience, it doesn't need permission, it doesn't ask for applause. It just leads, quietly, unshakably, until the rest of us finally catch up. But the truth, no matter how powerfully spoken, is never enough on its own. Because the story Jasmine Crockett carved out of silence isn't meant to end in inspiration. It's meant to provoke something deeper, something harder, something lasting. Her words, etched now in hallways and homes, weren't the finale. They were a match struck in a room soaked with kindling. And now, with the air charged and hearts awakened, the question can no longer be ignored. What will we do with the fire she lit? This isn't just about one woman on a stage. It's about every person watching, every student scrubbing dishes after class, every parent working a night shift while their child sleeps, every immigrant who was told to be silent to survive. It's about recognizing that injustice doesn't always wear a uniform or hold a weapon. Sometimes it wears a suit. Sometimes it smiles as it devalues someone's story with a joke and a headline. And if we let that go unanswered, if we settle for nodding along and clicking like as if that's enough, then we are no better than those who build systems on silence and call it order. So here's the question Jasmine never had to say out loud, because her life screamed it. Will you just clap or will you stand? Because standing means more than applause. It means risk. It means speaking up in meetings where it's easier to stay quiet. It means hiring people based on potential, not polish. It means correcting the person next to you when they degrade someone's labor and calling out the smirks that follow. It means teaching children that excellence isn't inherited, it's earned. And often it begins with a mop, not a microphone. Change doesn't start in Capitol buildings. It starts in kitchens, in classrooms, in every overlooked hallway where someone with less is doing more. Jasmine showed us that leadership is not defined by who speaks the most, but by who keeps showing up long after the world has turned away. And that's where we come in, because the systems she survived are still here, still rewarding the privileged, still mocking the poor, still pretending that lived experience is a liability instead of a credential made of fire. So don't wait for another Jasmine. Don't sit back and hope the next underdog finds their way through the cracks. Be the one who widens the cracks into doors. If you're a teacher, read her words to your class. If you're an employer, reevaluate how you define qualified. If you're a voter, ask yourself who truly understands the people they claim to serve, not just through polished speeches, but through the lives they've lived. And if you're someone who's still fighting, still unseen, still holding on by your fingertips, know this: you are not alone. Your story is not too small. Your labor is not beneath dignity. Your life is not a footnote. It is the center of the page. Because Jasmine's strength wasn't just in surviving the insult. It was in absorbing it, then turning it into a call loud enough to move a nation. But she cannot carry it alone, and she shouldn't have to. We owe her more than a standing ovation. We owe her action, the kind that doesn't wait for permission, the kind that tears down the lie that only the privileged deserve to be heard, the kind that writes a new future, not in slogans, but in policy, in hiring, in education, in how we see each other when no one else is watching. This is the moment. Not someday, not after the next election, not after the next scandal. Now, because there are millions of Jasmines out there, scrubbing, stacking, sweeping, surviving, and if we don't fight to make room for them, we're not just failing them, we're failing ourselves. The country Jasmine believes in isn't a dream. It's a blueprint, one built not on legacy, but on labor, not on connections, but on character, not on titles, but on truth. And so, as her photo fades from trending lists and her quote becomes part of Monday rituals, We must ask, what are we building with the pieces she handed us? Are we content to frame them on our walls? Or will we use them to knock down the ceilings, still pressing against the heads of the unheard? This is not about admiration. It's about transformation. It's about rethinking who we trust, who we follow, and who we allow to define worth. Jasmine Crockett didn't ask for the spotlight. She stood in it because she had already survived the dark, and now she's left the light on for the rest of us. So Stian, not just in applause, but in purpose. Speak, not just in debate, but in defiance of the silence that kills stories like hers before they begin. And build, not just careers or reputations, but bridges wide enough for every janitor, every caretaker, every invisible worker who's been told they don't belong. Because they do. And now, we know better. Let it begin now, not in some distant promise of reform, not in the slow churn of bureaucracy, but in the immediacy of today, in your workplace, your school, your home. Because what Jasmine stirred in us was not just a sentiment, it was a summons, a call not to admiration, but to accountability. And accountability starts with choices so small, they're almost invisible, until they aren't. It begins when a hiring manager reconsiders a resume that lacks prestige, but holds perseverance. It begins when a teacher sees potential in a quiet student who arrives with bleach-stained sleeves. It begins when a senator reads Jasmine's quote aloud on the chamber floor, not as a performance, but as a promise. Dignity isn't decided by your title. It's revealed by what you do when no one's watching. Those words are not just profound. They are disruptive. They dismantle the narrative that worth must be performed, that power must be inherited, that leadership must be loud. And that disruption is our task now, to carry her sentence into policy, into paychecks, into culture. Let us make it so that no child ever has to choose between feeding their siblings and being seen as worthy. Let us make it so that stories like Jasmine's are not rare miracles, but expected proof that brilliance comes from every corner of this country, not just its boardrooms. Let us remind every smug voice that mocked her that the floor she once scrubbed now reflects their own reflection. And they are the ones who must answer for what they have done when no one's watching. So when you leave this page, this video, this moment, don't let it pass through you like wind. Let it move you like gravity. Carry Jasmine's legacy not as a symbol, but as a strategy. Share her story not just for likes, but for change. Hold her quiet power in your palm and press it into your next decision, your next challenge, your next act of decency that no one sees but still matters. Because it's not about being viral, it's about being vital to someone somewhere who is still fighting to be seen. And if we rise with her, not just in memory, but in mission, we won't just honor Jasmine Crockett, we'll finish what she started. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.